They say Nevada nights hold secrets, most of them buried in dust and silence, some echoing in the thunder. Evelyn Tran stood at the window of her solitary ranch house, staring into a world caught between shadow and storm. The sky churned with black clouds, and wind clawed at the corners of her cabin, rattling the shutters as if warning her to stay inside. Rain hammered the tin roof, drumming a restless tattoo that refused to let her sleep. She poured herself another cup of coffee, hands trembling just a little. These were the nights she feared most, the ones when the past seemed to gather in the darkness outside and threaten to break in. She'd come to this place, 200 isolated acres skirting the foothills outside Elko, for a fresh start. A year ago, her name had been on every academic tongue in the Western wildlife research world, both admired and doubted. Then came the scandal. A lab partner's falsified data, a conference gone wrong, accusations swirling around like vultures. Evelyn hadn't been guilty, but that didn't matter in the end. The university's silence was louder than any verdict. She withdrew, cut her losses, and started over in a place where the only eyes on her were wild and amber, watching from the sagebrush. Lightning forked across the sky, snapping her back to the present. The power flickered, then held steady. Evelyn set the mug down, wrapped her arms around herself, and tried to breathe. The wind rose again, a living thing, shrieking across the open range. That was when she heard it. The frantic drum of hooves, pounding closer, echoing in the sodden ground. She moved to the door, every muscle tense, and peered out into the roiling blackness. The porch light barely pierced the rain, but she saw movement, large, swift, wild, her breath caught. There, at the edge of the lamplight, stood a black Mustang stallion. The storm sculpted him from darkness, his coat slick with rain, nostrils flared, chest heaving. He was more shadow than substance, but his eyes, those eyes, caught her and held her in place. She opened the door a crack, letting cold air whip around her. The Mustang didn't shy. Instead, he stepped forward, tossing his head, then stamped a hoof, urgent. Evelyn's heart hammered. Wild horses sometimes came close to her ranch, but never like this. Never with such deliberate intent. She hesitated, one step back, then forward. "Easy," she whispered, voice lost in the wind. "What's wrong?" The stallion, sentinel. She remembered the herd from her notes. The unique crescent-shaped scar above his left knee. Locked eyes with her again. This wasn't random panic. His gaze was clear, pleading, as if language itself trembled on his tongue. Sentinel jerked his head toward the open fields beyond the house, then back at her, then again, insistent. Every part of his body quivered with urgency. Evelyn felt the hairs on her neck stand up. A rational voice, her old advisors, cold and clinical, echoed in her mind. "Don't anthropomorphize." But standing there, on the threshold between safety and the wild, Evelyn knew instinctively that this animal was asking for help. Another burst of thunder shook the porch. Sentinel whinnied, stamping again, spraying mud. He spun once, trotted a few steps into the darkness, then circled back, snorting and staring straight at her. Evelyn's body moved before her mind could catch up. She grabbed a flashlight, her rain jacket, and an old first aid kit. The rational part of her screamed at the stupidity, wandering into a storm, chasing after a wild Mustang with nothing but a flashlight and hope. But the pull was stronger. There was a story in Sentinel's eyes, a need that transcended her own fears. She hurried down the porch steps, boots sinking in the mud. The wind threatened to steal her breath away, but Sentinel waited, stamping, urging her on. He led her away from the warm glow of her cabin, out into the tempest. Lightning split the sky above them, bathing the world in a sickly white flash. For a split second, Evelyn saw sentinels herd, shadowy forms flickering in and out of existence on the distant ridge. Then the darkness swallowed everything again. Sentinel moved at a controlled trot, glancing back every few steps to ensure Evelyn followed. She ducked under the splintered branches of a wind-blown juniper, slipping once, catching herself on a rock slick with rain. The air smelled of ozone, earth, and the wild scent of horse. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, but Evelyn pressed on, following the black stallion deeper into the unknown. Time lost all meaning. She barely noticed her hands going numb, the wind biting through her jacket, or the ache in her lungs. She focused only on Sentinel's shape, glistening and ghostly in the gloom, guiding her forward with unwavering purpose. Suddenly, Sentinel halted. Evelyn almost crashed into his flank. The beam of her flashlight danced over the ground, barbed wire, twisted and half-buried, old and dangerous. Beyond it, in the mud, lay a tangle of legs and a splash of white. A young Mustang, a filly, struggling, trapped. Blood streaked her coat, and her breaths came in short, desperate gasps. Evelyn knelt beside the fence, her own heart breaking at the sight. The filly's eyes rolled with pain and terror. Sentinel whinnied softly, lowering his head until his muzzle almost touched the filly's mane. For a moment, all the world was rain and breath and wild hope. Evelyn reached out, speaking softly, voice steady despite the storm, and realized that the call that had awakened her was never just about the storm or the ranch or even the horses. It was about trust, a silent, impossible bond forming in the Nevada night. She pressed her hands to the filly's side, felt the warmth of life fighting against the cold. "I'm here," she whispered, not knowing if she spoke to the Mustangs, herself, or something greater. "I'm not leaving." The storm raged on. Somewhere in the distance, the herd watched, silent witnesses. And in that darkness, Evelyn understood. This was the beginning of something wild and true, a story only the night could call forth. Evelyn's breath fogged in the night air as she dropped to her knees beside the injured filly. The rain still lashed sideways, soaking her hair, plastering her jacket to her skin, making her movements slow and clumsy. Her flashlight beam trembled, throwing wild shadows across the mud. For a moment, all she could hear was the filly's harsh, panicked breathing and the deep, rhythmic thunder of Sentinel's hooves behind her. She forced herself to focus. The filly's legs were twisted in the rusty strands of barbed wire, blood pooling around her fetlocks, muscles spasming in pain. Her pale coat was streaked with mud, and her eyes rolled white with terror. One wrong move, and the filly could injure herself even worse, or injure Evelyn. Evelyn swallowed, trying to steady her hands, then shrugged off her jacket and pressed it gently against the worst of the bleeding. The filly shuddered, but didn't kick. Sentinel stood guard a few paces away, body rigid, ears pinned, nostrils flared. He watched Evelyn with a ferocity that promised violence to anything that threatened the wounded filly. Evelyn felt the stallion's presence like a shadow at her back, equal parts reassurance and warning. Every time she glanced up, Sentinel's eyes found hers, searching, challenging, and beneath it all, desperately hoping. Evelyn's mind raced through everything she'd learned about wild horse behavior, medical emergencies, and field improvisation. She fumbled in her kit for bandages and antiseptic, her fingers stiff with cold. Each time she touched the filly, She murmured soft, steady words, trying to project calm, though inside she was anything but calm. "It's okay. You're safe now. I've got you. Just hold on." Lightning tore open the sky, revealing the distant shapes of other Mustangs, sentinels heard, pacing nervously at the edge of the field. Their eyes gleamed in the flash, wary but not hostile, sensing the crisis and the strange alliance forming between human and horse. The storm intensified, rain coming down in sheets, mud swallowing Evelyn's boots with every movement. She pulled her knife from her belt, hesitated, then set to work on the tangled wire. The filly jerked in pain, hooves lashing out in a panic, but Sentinel lunged forward, blocking her with his body, his own flank dangerously close to Evelyn's head. For one heart-stopping moment, Evelyn thought she'd be trampled. She froze, waiting for pain, but Sentinel simply lowered his head, pushing between her and the filly as if to shield both from harm. Time slowed to a crawl. Evelyn worked the knife under the tightest loop, sawing slowly, careful not to nick the filly's skin. The wind screamed in her ears, mud splattered her glasses, and the stench of blood and wet earth filled her senses. Finally, with a gasp of effort, the wire snapped loose. The filly struggled, muscles bunching for another desperate kick. Evelyn threw herself sideways, barely dodging a flailing hoof, landing hard in the mud. Her chest heaved, adrenaline burning away the cold. For a moment, she lay there, rain hammering her face, blinking up at Sentinel. The stallion snorted and stamped the ground, then stepped between her and the filly's dangerous legs, giving Evelyn a narrow window to finish. She crawled back, ignoring the pain in her knees, and pressed the jacket tighter to the wound. Blood still oozed, but the worst of it seemed to be slowing. "Stay with me," she whispered, voice hoarse, more to herself than anyone. She wrapped the filly's leg in the bandages, tying them as tightly as she dared. Another crash of thunder rolled overhead, closer now, making Sentinel rear in alarm. Evelyn threw out an arm to shield her face, heart pounding. The stallion landed hard, but instead of fleeing, he stood his ground, eyes locked on Evelyn, as if weighing every move she made. She finished bandaging the filly, then cut the last strands of wire trapping her. The filly slumped sideways, body quivering, too exhausted to stand. Evelyn tried to lift her, gritting her teeth, mud sucking at her boots. She slipped, falling hard again, but managed to wedge her shoulder under the filly's chest, half lifting, half dragging her toward the safety of the ranch in the distance. Sentinel trotted alongside, never more than a pace away. Each time the filly whimpered, he pressed his nose to her neck, murmuring encouragement in that strange language only horses understood. The other Mustangs watched from the shadows, their anxiety palpable, but Sentinel kept them at bay, his presence the only thing keeping the whole situation from dissolving into chaos. Step by agonizing step, Evelyn and Sentinel dragged the filly across the sodden field. Her arms screamed with effort, her breath coming in ragged gasps, but she refused to let go. The barn was still 100 yards away, an eternity in this storm. Suddenly, headlights swept across the field, a neighbor's truck caught by the movement. Evelyn's heart leapt in her chest. For a moment, she feared the interruption would spook the horses, but Sentinel stood his ground, muscles bunched, daring anyone to come closer. The truck idled at a distance, its driver watching in mute astonishment as Evelyn and the Mustang worked together to save the filly. At last, they reached the barn. Evelyn threw open the doors, dragging the filly inside. Sentinel hesitated at the threshold, nostrils flaring, then stepped in, head high, every muscle taut. Evelyn laid the filly on a pile of old hay, hands shaking, and collapsed beside her. The filly's eyes flickered, then closed. Not dead, but finally able to rest. For a moment, everything was still. Sentinel stood over the filly, breathing hard, steam rising from his coat. Evelyn knelt in the straw, muddy and soaked and shaking, unable to believe what they'd accomplished together. In the howling darkness outside, the herd circled the barn, their silhouettes ghostly in the rain. Inside, Human and Mustang watched over their rescued charge, a fragile alliance, born of storm and desperation, that would change everything. Evelyn realized then that she had crossed a line. She was no longer just a witness to the wild. She was part of it now, bound to these creatures by trust and necessity, whatever tomorrow would bring. The world outside the barn had dissolved into a blurry curtain of rain and darkness, but inside, under the shaky yellow light of a single lantern, Evelyn worked with a quiet intensity. Every movement was deliberate. Her hands, still shaking from adrenaline and cold, cleaned the filly's wounds as gently as possible. Mud caked her jeans. Stray hay clung to her wet hair. It didn't matter. The only thing that mattered now was Willow's breathing, shallow but steady. She named the filly Willow, after the way her legs, long and slender, bent with a trembling grace even when tangled in pain. Sentinel stood just inside the barn door, drenched and restless. His black coat shone beneath the light, his eyes never leaving either Willow or Evelyn. Every so often, he'd paw at the ground or stamp in protest, as if daring the night to challenge them again. Evelyn kept a running log on her phone, voice barely above a whisper as she recorded every step. Subject: Mustang filly, approximately 1 year old, white blaze, severe lacerations to foreleg. Initial treatment: pressure with sterile cloth, field bandage, shelter in barn. She paused, glancing at Sentinel, who snorted softly, guarded by presumed alpha stallion. Behavior: exceptional alertness and low aggression toward human contact, despite stress factors. Unprecedented. The hours dragged on. She set up a makeshift stall using leftover wood panels, laid out more clean hay, and coaxed Willow to drink water with a cut-down soda bottle. Sometimes, when Willow whimpered or shifted in pain, Evelyn would hum softly, old songs her grandmother sang in a language that felt as wild and secret as the Mustangs themselves. She lost track of time, moving between tending to Willow's wounds and scribbling observations in her battered field notebook, fingers cramping from exhaustion but unwilling to rest. Rain battered the roof, the rhythm relentless. Occasionally, the wind would gust so fiercely that it sent a fine mist swirling in under the eaves, chilling the air. Sentinel would flick his ears and flare his nostrils, muscles tensing until the world settled back into its quiet, storm-shrouded routine. Evelyn watched him with cautious awe. In another life, he might have been a legend, a spirit in horse's flesh, wild and uncatchable. Now he stood watch, refusing to leave even as the sky began to lighten, rain slowing from a torrent to a persistent drizzle. As dawn crept in, painting the horizon a sullen gray, a battered blue truck bounced down the muddy drive. Evelyn's shoulders tensed. She wiped her hands on her jeans, grabbed her phone and first aid kit, and stepped outside. The truck door swung open. Out stepped Dr. Lynn Martinez, the county's only large animal vet, short, middle-aged, and formidable, with hair pulled back in a tight ponytail and boots that had seen 1,000 muddy mornings. "Tran?" Lynn called, brow furrowing as she took in the scene. The wild black stallion, the sodden barn, the pale Mustang filly barely visible inside. Evelyn managed a nod. "You got my message. Thanks for coming." Lynn's eyes narrowed. "You said it was urgent. I was halfway through a calving at the McAllister place. What in God's name?" She stopped short as Sentinel snorted, stamping hard enough to rattle the barn wall. Evelyn moved to stand between Lynn and the stallion, hands up. "It's okay. He's guarding her. She's injured, caught in barbed wire. I got her loose, but she's lost a lot of blood." Lynn glanced from Evelyn to Sentinel and back, clearly weighing her options. "That's not a domestic. Is that... Are you keeping wild horses in your barn now?" "It was an emergency. I didn't have a choice," Evelyn said, a stubborn edge to her voice. "If I hadn't stepped in, she'd have died out there." Lynn took a slow step forward, watching Sentinel, who eyed her with suspicion but didn't move. "He's not letting you out of his sight, is he?" Evelyn shook her head. "Not since last night. He's different." Lynn grunted, grabbing her bag and moving carefully, speaking as much to Sentinel as to Evelyn. "All right, big guy. Let's see what your friend needs." Inside, Lynn examined Willow, her professionalism overcoming her skepticism. "You did good work here," she said, binding the wound with practiced hands, checking the filly's pulse, then looking Evelyn square in the eye. "But if anyone from Fish and Wildlife hears about this, you'll have a dozen trucks on your lawn before noon." Evelyn nodded, lips pressed tight. "Let them come. I'm not turning her out to die. Not after last night." They worked together in the close confines of the barn, tending to Willow, swapping stories in hushed tones. The storm's violence had left fences down all over the county. News traveled fast in small towns. By noon, a neighbor had stopped by to borrow a cup of sugar and left with a tale of the wild stallion standing sentry over a wounded filly. By afternoon, Evelyn's phone was buzzing. Text messages from old colleagues, emails from a few who still believed in her, and even a couple from strangers who'd heard rumors of a midnight rescue. One message stood out, a brief note from her old research supervisor. "Heard you're up to your old tricks again. Good luck, Tran. Don't let the locals eat you alive." She almost laughed, but the sting of old wounds lingered. As the day faded, Sentinel remained, never once leaving Willow's side. The barn became a sanctuary, a place where trust was built in quiet glances and shared silences. In the evenings, Evelyn found herself updating her online field journal, posting careful updates about a rescued filly and her guardian. Comments began to pour in, some skeptical, many moved by the unfolding story. That night, as Evelyn checked Willow's bandages one last time, Sentinel nudged her arm with his soft muzzle, eyes meeting hers. For a moment, she forgot the world's judgments and felt only gratitude. Against all odds, here they were, 3 survivors, forging a fragile bond in the aftermath of a storm. And outside, beneath a clearing sky, the distant shapes of Mustangs grazed the horizon, waiting, watching, witnesses to something quietly extraordinary. Over the next several days, the rhythm of Evelyn's world changed. She awoke at dawn, sometimes to the sound of Willow's restless shifting or Sentinel's low snort outside the barn. The Nevada sun returned with merciless clarity, baking the sodden ground into a patchwork of cracked mud and green shoots. Inside the barn, light filtered in through the gaps in the wood, dust swirling in golden beams. The storm was gone, but its memory lingered in every cautious movement and quiet moment. Evelyn's days took on a new cadence. Feed, clean, check wounds, document, repeat. Willow, still weak and wary, began to respond to Evelyn's touch. The bandages were changed twice daily, the wounds flushed with saline, each action accompanied by soft words and gentle hands. The filly's eyes, once wild with pain and fear, now lingered on Evelyn with hesitant trust. Sentinel visited each morning and evening, slipping from the shadows at the edge of the fields. He never ventured far from the barn, never let Willow out of sight. Sometimes he would stand at the door, just beyond the reach of Evelyn's hand, muscles taut, tail flicking, a sentinel in every sense. Other times, he'd nudge a forgotten apple closer, or nicker softly when Willow called. Their connection, forged in crisis, deepened through silent understanding. Dr. Lynn Martinez came by every other day. She never said much about the risks, but her actions spoke volumes, arriving with fresh medical supplies, teaching Evelyn new techniques for wound care, and even leaving behind a worn stethoscope, just in case. One morning, Lynn stood in the doorway, arms folded, watching Evelyn soothe Willow through a bout of fever. "You know," she finally said, "I've worked 30 years in this county. Never seen a wild horse trust a human like this, or a human earn it." Evelyn smiled, not breaking eye contact with Willow. "Maybe we're both just tired of running." Lynn grunted, lips twitching in a rare hint of amusement, and handed her another roll of bandage. Word about Willow and Sentinel spread quickly through the small town. A teacher from the elementary school, Mrs. Herrera, reached out, asking if her students could come by, just to watch from a safe distance. "Some of these kids have never seen a Mustang up close," she said over the phone. "I think it'd mean a lot." Evelyn hesitated. She'd come to Nevada for solitude, not a classroom, but something in Mrs. Herrera's voice, hope, maybe, or longing for connection, made her agree. The following Friday, a line of battered yellow school buses wound up the gravel road to her ranch, carrying 24 wide-eyed children, their faces pressed to the glass. Evelyn set boundaries, keeping the kids behind a makeshift rope line, far enough that Willow wouldn't spook. Sentinel appeared at the edge of the field, watching, head high and ears forward, a living myth. The children fell silent, eyes huge. One little boy whispered, "He looks like a king." Willow, fragile but curious, lifted her head as the group settled down. Evelyn explained the basics, what a Mustang was, why wild horses mattered, how Willow had gotten hurt. She kept her language simple, her tone soft. A little girl with pigtails asked, "Does it hurt when horses get scared?" Evelyn nodded, letting the silence answer for her. When the visit ended, the children left hand-drawn cards, crayon sketches of horses and storm clouds, and a woman with wild black hair. Evelyn hung them on the barn wall. In the evenings, she found herself looking at those cards, tracing the uneven lines, feeling something unfamiliar warm her chest. Online, her story found traction too. She posted careful updates to her field log and social media, never using real names, always emphasizing conservation and empathy. Photos of Willow, her wounds healing, Sentinel standing guard, the kids watching from afar, went viral in a small way. Comments poured in. Some accused her of interfering with nature. Others thanked her for her compassion. One message from a woman in Wyoming simply read, "Thank you for showing my daughter that wild things can be saved, not just feared." At night, alone in her cabin, Evelyn scrolled through those messages. She had spent years feeling invisible, her work dismissed or overshadowed by the mistakes of others. Now, strangers saw her, not just as a scientist, but as a bridge between worlds, wild and human. As Willow's strength grew, so did her confidence. She ventured farther into the paddock, nipping at tufts of grass, occasionally kicking up her heels in a burst of clumsy joy. Sentinel watched every move, a silent guardian. One afternoon, Evelyn stood in the paddock, arms folded as Willow approached, sniffed her sleeve, and allowed her hand to rest on her neck. Sentinel stamped a warning but did not intervene. For the first time, Evelyn let herself hope that Willow might recover fully, that this filly who had survived a storm, barbed wire, and the odds could one day run free again. One evening, after Lynn had left and the sun had dipped below the mountains, Evelyn stood by the fence, watching Sentinel graze. The breeze was cool and gentle. She found herself speaking softly, not sure if she meant the words for the horses, the world, or herself. I thought I'd lost everything when I came here. Turns out I was just starting over. In the distance, the Mustang herd gathered on the ridge, their silhouettes framed by the last golden light. Willow lifted her head and whinnied, a sound of longing, strength, and a wildness that would never be fully tamed. Evelyn smiled, hope rising with the stars. Whatever came next, she was ready. The Nevada summer arrived in a rush of heat and dry wind, baking the ranch land and drawing long cracks through the earth. Evelyn woke one morning to find dust filtering through her open window, the scent of sage and sun already strong. For a few precious weeks, she'd allowed herself to believe in a fragile peace, a world held together by the quiet trust between a woman, a stallion, and a rescued filly. But peace, she would soon learn, rarely lasts when humans catch wind of something unusual. Word about the Mustang rescue had traveled farther than Evelyn realized. At first, the visitors were harmless. Neighbors with curious children, local teachers, even a few old-timers from town who remembered when wild horses used to roam the hills by the thousands. But soon, other faces appeared. A pair of county officials, their white truck gleaming, stopped by with clipboards and sharp eyes. Evelyn met them at the gate, arms folded, a polite smile hiding her unease. "We're just following up on reports of a wild Mustang kept in captivity," the older one said, peering past her at the barn where Willow dozed in the shade. "State law says you have to notify wildlife management if you're sheltering any non-domestic equines." "She's injured," Evelyn replied, keeping her tone calm but firm. "A vet's been treating her. This isn't a petting zoo. She'll be released when she's ready." The younger official scribbled something down, glancing from Evelyn to the corral, then back. "We'll need to see those vet records, and you may want to reconsider. There are liability issues, disease, safety, property damage. It's not just your problem if that horse escapes or causes trouble." Evelyn felt her jaw tighten. "I'll provide the records. She's not a threat to anyone." The men left with tight smiles, but their visit lingered like a warning. That afternoon, Lynn stopped by and listened quietly as Evelyn recounted the conversation. Lynn snorted. "Bureaucracy. Half the time they can't tell a Mustang from a mule. But you should keep everything documented. Cover yourself." That evening, Sentinel circled the perimeter of the ranch with unusual restlessness. Evelyn watched him from the porch as dusk settled over the land. He moved with a purpose, mane streaming in the wind, his shape flickering in and out of the deepening shadows. Willow, now walking more steadily, nickered when she saw him, her bond with the stallion growing stronger each day. The other Mustangs lingered at the fence line, eyes glinting in the half-light. It wasn't long before darker rumors reached Evelyn's ears. A rancher stopped her at the feed store, voice low. "Heard there's been poachers out by the old North Ridge. A couple of my cows went missing. Folks say they've seen trucks at night, men with rifles. You keep an eye out." That night, Evelyn reviewed the feed from her security cameras. A recent precaution, after several neighbors warned her about trespassers and unsavory types taking an interest in wild horses. At first, the footage showed nothing but wind and dust, jackrabbits darting past the barn. But just after midnight, headlights flashed across the far end of her property, lingering at the tree line. Two figures moved through the darkness, their forms indistinct but unmistakably human. One carried something slung over his shoulder, a rifle, or maybe a crowbar. Evelyn's blood ran cold. She locked every door and window, checked the barn twice, and sat up late with a flashlight in her lap. The storm that had once felt like the enemy now seemed like a lost friend. At least thunder and rain cared nothing for profit. The next day, she met with Lynn and showed her the video. "That's not just curiosity," Evelyn whispered, her voice tense. "That's scouting for something. Maybe horses, maybe trouble." Lynn nodded grimly. "You should call the sheriff and add more lights by the barn. I'll stay the night if you want." Evelyn hesitated, pride warring with gratitude. In the end, she nodded. "Thank you. I'd appreciate the company." They made preparations. Motion-activated lights at the corners of the barn, extra locks, the shotgun Lynn kept in her truck placed by the door. Sentinel, as if understanding the new threat, became even more vigilant. He paced the property line all night, mane rippling, eyes bright with intelligence. Willow slept inside. Her wounds nearly healed, but her body still thin and fragile. The rest of the herd kept close, drawn by the stallion's unease. 2 nights later, just after midnight, the cameras caught movement again. This time, the figures were bolder, moving closer, shining flashlights into the barn. Sentinel's silhouette appeared on the feed, standing between the barn and the intruders, his head high and body rigid. Evelyn and Lynn watched from the darkened kitchen, hearts pounding. They dialed the sheriff, barely whispering, afraid any sound might give them away. The figures didn't get closer. Sentinel charged the fence, rearing and slamming his hooves against the boards. One of the men shouted, stumbling back. A dog barked somewhere far off. The intruders retreated, swallowed by the dark. When it was over, Evelyn sagged against the wall, relief and fear mingling in her veins. Lynn poured them both strong coffee. "You've got a protector out there," she said quietly. "That stallion isn't just watching over Willow. He's watching over you, too." Evelyn went out before dawn, standing quietly by the fence. Sentinel approached, nostrils flaring, eyes sharp but not unkind. She reached out, touching his neck. "Thank you," she murmured, feeling a bond deeper than fear or gratitude. From that night on, the ranch seemed different. The lines between wild and tame, human and Mustang, blurred. Trust had become their only defense, and their only hope. The Nevada winds returned with a vengeance. What began as a whisper through the sage became a relentless gale by sundown, rattling the barn doors and driving loose dust in wild spirals across the yard. Evelyn double-checked the latches, her nerves raw from the recent threats and the sleepless nights. Sentinel circled the paddock restlessly, his silhouette ghostly against the swirling twilight, every muscle tense, every movement sharp with anticipation. Willow, though stronger each day, still moved with caution, favoring her healing leg, but growing bolder under Sentinel's watchful eye. Inside the house, Evelyn watched the clouds massing on the horizon, the sky bruised and electric with promise of a storm. Lynn had offered to stay another night, but Evelyn, stubborn as ever, insisted she'd be fine. She needed quiet, or so she told herself. But beneath her tough exterior, worry churned. About Willow, about the men who'd prowled the ranch, about the delicate balance she'd built, now threatened from all sides. The first gust hit just before midnight. It sounded like the world itself was being torn in two. Evelyn jolted awake, the air thick with static and fear. A branch crashed against her roof. Then another sound, sharper, metallic, ripped through the howling night. The barn gate. It hadn't held. She bolted upright, heart racing, fumbling for her boots and jacket. Outside, the wind nearly knocked her over, the cold biting and fierce. Her flashlight's beam danced wildly as she ran for the barn, boots splashing in half-frozen puddles. The barn door stood open, swinging on its hinges, slamming against the wall. Hay and debris whipped in crazy circles. The paddock gate was gone. The latch shattered. And Willow was gone. Evelyn's breath caught in her chest. She turned, shining the flashlight in frantic arcs. Far across the fields, she caught the fleeting gleam of a pale shape. Willow, running for the open range. Her movements awkward, but determined. Sentinel's dark form charged after her, his cry cutting through the storm. Behind them, the rest of the herd surged into motion, wild energy unleashed by the chaos. Evelyn's first instinct was to chase after them, but she forced herself to pause, to think like the scientist she was. If Willow panicked and ran too hard, she could tear her wound open. And there were worse dangers than the weather. Poachers, traps, the uncertain mercy of strangers. She hurried back inside, grabbing her field bag, radio, and a worn map of the ranch and surrounding public land. Her hands shook as she dialed Lynn. The vet answered on the second ring, her voice thick with sleep. "Lynn, it's Willow. The gate's down, she's out. Sentinel's with her. The herd too, I need help." "I'm on my way," Lynn replied without hesitation. "Call the rangers. Don't go after them alone." But Evelyn was already moving, her fear outpacing her better judgment. She called the local ranger station, left a message, then set off in the direction she'd seen Willow running, her flashlight cutting through the dark. The wind howled around her, making every step a battle. The air full of dust and flying grit. Somewhere ahead, Sentinel's call echoed, a wild, urgent sound that sent shivers down her spine. She reached the old north pasture, her boots sinking into mud, the grass flattened by the storm. She found hoofprints, deep, erratic, two sets traveling together, then joined by more. Here and there, she spotted flashes of white hair snagged on barbed wire, drops of blood marking the trail. She knelt, pressing her fingers to the ground, forcing herself to breathe, to think like a Mustang. If she were Sentinel, she'd stay close to cover, avoid open ground, keep the herd together. But Willow's injury made her vulnerable, her movements unpredictable. And now, with the threat of poachers lurking, every minute mattered. Headlights appeared in the distance, bouncing over the rutted road. Lynn's truck, followed by a wildlife service jeep. Relief warred with dread as the small group gathered under the shelter of Evelyn's barn. Together, they laid out a plan. Split up, sweep the property and adjacent range, stay in constant radio contact. "I found fresh tracks, here and here," Evelyn pointed out on the map, her voice taut. "Sentinels trying to shield her. They'll keep her close to water, maybe the arroyo by the ridge." "Watch for traps," Lynn warned, loading her own first aid bag. "If poachers are out, they'll use anything, snares, bait, even spike strips." Evelyn nodded, a knot tightening in her chest. She set out with 2 rangers, following the muddy tracks under the faint glow of flashlights. The land felt vast and hostile, every bush and rock looming in the shifting light. Coyotes yipped in the distance. The wind rattled a loose length of wire against a fence post, a sound too close to a gunshot. After an hour of searching, they found evidence of trouble. A rusted steel trap, partially sprung, lay hidden in the tall grass, its jaws stained with fresh blood. Evelyn's heart sank. Sentinel's hoofprints circled the trap, the ground torn by frantic movements. He'd protected Willow, driven her away from danger, but the threat was real and close. They pressed on, voices low, nerves raw. Sometimes Evelyn called out, "Willow! Sentinel!" Her voice sounded small in the endless dark, swallowed by wind and the vast Nevada sky. Once she thought she glimpsed movement, two shapes against the rocks, gone in an instant. The group decided to split, covering more ground. Evelyn went east, her familiarity with the terrain guiding her steps. Every sense was heightened. She tracked broken branches, scattered horsehair, the faint scent of sweat and blood. In the hollow near an ancient juniper, she paused, listening. There, a whinny, muffled but distinct, drifting from the direction of the canyon. Her pulse quickened. She radioed the others, then pushed ahead, climbing over rocks slick with rain. The path grew steeper, the footing treacherous, but she pressed on, drawn by the echo of hope and fear. Above, the moon broke through the clouds, casting everything in silver-blue light. For the briefest moment, Evelyn saw them, Sentinel, his body tense and protective, Willow standing unsteadily beside him. But something else moved in the shadows beyond, a human silhouette crouched low, watching. Evelyn's heart pounded. The search was far from over. The wild was no longer the only danger. Human greed, too, prowled these hills. She gripped her flashlight tighter, hope and dread warring inside her as she moved forward into the unknown, the fragile thread of trust between woman and Mustang, her only guide through the darkness. The canyon was a jagged scar in the Nevada landscape, carved by centuries of wind and rain. Evelyn moved along its rim, heart thudding, hands clenched around her flashlight and radio. Below, the world was a labyrinth of stone and shadow, every sound magnified by the high rock walls. She crept forward, senses stretched taut, every nerve alive with fear and adrenaline. Somewhere down there, Sentinel and Willow were trapped. Evelyn could see the dark shape of the stallion, his body tensed protectively around the filly, blocking her from view. Willow pressed close to the canyon wall, trembling, her breathing audible even from above. Across the narrow ravine, two men crouched behind a fallen log, rifles slung at their sides, flashlights painting restless beams along the rocks. Poachers. There was no mistaking it now. Their voices, low and sharp, carried through the cool night air, the words ugly and impatient. "Just spook 'em," one hissed. "Horse gets hurt, nobody cares. She's worth a payday if we can haul her out of here." Evelyn's hands shook. She pressed herself lower against the ground, eyes scanning for anything, any distraction, any sign of the others. The Rangers were still somewhere behind her, but she couldn't wait. Every second Willow and Sentinel spent cornered was a second closer to disaster. She fumbled in her bag for the air horn she'd grabbed at the last moment, a leftover from the days when she needed to scare coyotes away from the herd. Her fingers found the cold plastic, wrapped tight. Just one blast, she thought. Enough to startle the men, maybe buy time. Down below, Sentinel stamped and reared, bellowing his own challenge, hooves striking sparks from the stone. The poachers flinched, backing away a few steps, but not retreating. The canyon's narrow floor trapped the Mustangs, nowhere to run but up the steep rock or into the men's waiting arms. Evelyn moved fast, finding the highest point of the rim. She raised the air horn and pressed the trigger. A shriek of sound split the night. The canyon magnified it 100 times, turning a single burst into an avalanche of noise. Birds exploded from the rocks. The poachers spun around, cursing and covering their ears. Sentinel seized the moment, charging forward, slamming his body between Willow and danger, his cry lost in the chaos. "Go, run!" Evelyn shouted, her voice ragged, praying the horses would sense her plea. Willow, wide-eyed, bolted along the narrow path, her gait awkward but determined. Sentinel followed, driving her forward, refusing to let her falter. The poachers scrambled to regroup, but their footing slipped on loose gravel. One fired a warning shot, the bullet sparking off the canyon wall. Evelyn's heart stuttered. She leapt to her feet, waving her flashlight, trying to draw the men's attention away from the fleeing Mustangs. "Hey! Over here! Leave them alone!" One man swore, swinging his rifle in her direction. Evelyn ducked, stones digging into her palms, breath coming in sharp, painful bursts. At that moment, headlights appeared at the canyon's far edge. Lynn's truck, followed by the Ranger Jeep. Red and blue lights flickered, sirens blaring, cutting through the night. The poachers froze, then turned and ran, scrambling up the far side of the canyon, disappearing into the brush. Evelyn scrambled down the rocky slope, ignoring the pain in her knees and elbows. She found Willow standing just below the rim, legs shaking but still upright. Sentinel pressed close, sides heaving, his coat streaked with sweat and dust. Evelyn sank to her knees, arms open. "It's okay," she whispered, voice thick with relief and tears. "You made it. You're safe now." Sentinel lowered his head, nostrils flaring, eyes still wide with battle. For a moment, human and horse stared at each other, 1,000 unspoken words passing between them. Evelyn reached out, barely brushing her fingers against his cheek. He did not flinch. Rangers reached her a minute later, weapons ready, eyes scanning the darkness. Lynn knelt beside Willow, hands gentle but sure, examining the filly's legs. "She's shaken up, but she'll make it. You did good, Tran." Sirens faded. The canyon filled with the voices of law enforcement, questions tumbling over each other. Evelyn described the scene, pointing to where the poachers had run, showing the rangers the discarded shell casing and the footprints in the soft dirt. "We got everything on camera," one ranger said, holding up his phone. "You're gonna be a hero after this." Evelyn managed a tired laugh. "I'd rather be invisible." But it was too late. The story was already out, caught on a bystander's phone, streamed to social media before the authorities even finished their sweep. Within hours, the video had gone viral. A lone woman standing between poachers and Mustangs. The storm, the chaos, the courage. Back at the barn, Sentinel and Willow were examined and cared for. Evelyn slumped against the wall, exhaustion pressing down on her, but a fierce pride burning in her chest. Lynn handed her a bottle of water, sitting beside her in the straw. "You're not just saving horses, you know," Lynn said quietly. "You're changing minds." Evelyn looked at the stallion and filly, two wild hearts, battered but unbroken. "I hope so," she murmured, "because I don't know how to be anything else." That night, sleep came late, filled with dreams of running hooves and thunder, of canyon walls and the taste of fear. But in the morning, the world was new, brighter somehow, as if the land itself recognized the victory won beneath the stars. Outside, Sentinel grazed by the fence, Willow at his side. The herd returned, encircling the ranch like silent sentinels. And for the first time, Evelyn let herself believe in a future where wildness and humanity might stand together, not as enemies, but as allies. Sunrise crept over the Nevada hills, casting the ranch in pale gold. The storm was gone, and with it, the worst of the fear that had clung to Evelyn like a second skin. Her home, battered but unbroken, stood as a testament to everything she'd risked and everything she'd learned. Word of the standoff at the canyon had spread quickly, picked up by local news and national outlets alike. Video of Sentinel rearing between poachers and Willow, Evelyn's frantic shouts, and the arrival of flashing police lights played again and again, a wild, real-life drama that no one could ignore. Reporters started calling. Conservationists from across the state sent messages of support. But there were also critics, those who said the Mustangs should never have been brought so close to people, that wild was wild for a reason. Evelyn ignored most of it. Her focus stayed on Willow and Sentinel. The vet, Dr. Lynn Martinez, visited daily now, always with a new bandage or a gentle joke to break the tension. Together, they checked Willow's leg, marveling at how well the filly was healing. "She's lucky," Lynn said one afternoon as Willow nuzzled her palm. "And you're lucky Sentinel trusted you at all. Most stallions would have trampled anyone who got close." Evelyn smiled, watching Sentinel graze in the sunlight just beyond the barn. "He's not like most stallions. I think he knew what was at stake. Maybe he knows it's time." Wildlife officials arrived with paperwork and quiet voices, asking Evelyn about her plans. They reviewed Willow's condition and the footage from the canyon, consulted their manuals, and shook their heads in wonder. "You've done something extraordinary," one of them told her, not quite able to hide his admiration. "But she can't stay here forever. It's not fair to her or to Sentinel's herd. Wild horses need each other. They need freedom." Evelyn understood. She'd always known this moment would come. Even so, the thought of letting Willow go, of releasing her back into a world full of risk and beauty and danger, made her heart ache with a mixture of pride and loss. Willow had become more than just a rescue. She was a living symbol of second chances, of what could happen when trust bridged the gap between human and wild. Word spread that there would be a release. Mrs. Herrera, the school teacher, called to ask if her students could come again. Neighbors who had watched the drama unfold from a distance asked if they could witness the moment. Evelyn hesitated, unused to so much attention, but Lynn squeezed her shoulder. "Let them see," she said. "Let them remember what's possible." On the day of the release, the ranch hummed with quiet excitement. Cars lined the dirt road. Families set up blankets along the fence line. Children waving homemade signs that read, "Run free, Willow," and "Thank you, Sentinel." Wildlife officers set up a small barrier to keep the crowd at a safe distance. Cameras flashed, but most people watched in respectful silence, understanding the gravity of what was about to happen. Evelyn stood with Willow in the barn, hands shaking as she removed the last bandage. "You're ready," she whispered, voice thick with emotion. "You were always meant to run." Sentinel waited outside, ears pricked forward, tail swishing, as if sensing the moment's importance. The rest of the herd gathered beyond the far fence, restless, calling softly to their leader and the filly who had been lost and found. Dr. Lynn handed Evelyn the gate key. "You want to do the honors?" Evelyn nodded, swallowing hard. She opened the paddock gate wide, sunlight pouring through. Willow hesitated, muscles trembling, then took a tentative step forward. Sentinel approached, nuzzling her gently, then threw his head back and let out a triumphant whinny. The herd answered, a chorus of wild voices rising above the crowd. Willow broke into a trot, then a gallop, her stride growing stronger with every step. Sentinel ran beside her, mane flying, the pair moving as one. The herd parted to let them through, then closed ranks, encircling Willow and Sentinel in a living embrace. It was not just a reunion. It was a moment of recognition. A wild family made whole again. The crowd watched in awed silence. Children clapped, adults wiped tears from their eyes. Lynn smiled through her own emotion. Evelyn stood by the open gate, heart pounding, as the Mustangs disappeared over the ridge, their bodies silhouetted against the endless blue sky. News crews captured the release, broadcasting the scene across the state. Conservation groups reposted the footage, calling it a model for human-wildlife partnership. Comments poured in online. People inspired, children asking questions, others sharing their own stories of animal rescue and hope. After the crowd left, Evelyn walked the now quiet ranch, every footstep echoing in the emptiness. The barn felt different without Willow's presence. Sentinel's absence was a physical ache, as if the ranch itself missed its wild guardian. But as she paused at the edge of her property, Evelyn saw the Mustang herd grazing on the distant hillside, Sentinel standing tall, Willow at his side. She smiled, feeling a bittersweet peace settle over her. The wild was where they belonged. She'd been given the rarest gift, a chance to help, to witness, and finally, to let go. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, the Mustang herd reappeared along the fence. Sentinel led them, Willow close behind, the pair pausing just long enough for Evelyn to see them clearly. Sentinel dipped his head in a gesture that felt almost like a bow. Willow pranced at his side, her coat catching the last golden light. Then, with a toss of their manes, the herd moved on, vanishing into the great silence of the Nevada desert. Evelyn stood alone, a quiet smile on her lips, her heart full. She had kept her promise to the Mustangs, to herself, and to the wildness she'd always loved. Sometimes, she realized, the bravest thing you can do is trust enough to let go. The release of Willow and Sentinel marked a turning point for Evelyn, for her ranch, and in some ways, for the wider conversation around wild horses in Nevada. The days after the release were strangely quiet. Without the urgent rhythm of medical care and the constant presence of Sentinel's watchful eyes, Evelyn found herself wandering the property with a sense of restlessness. She would catch glimpses of the herd on distant hills, Willow running free among her kind, Sentinel's proud silhouette often at her side. There was a deep comfort in seeing them thrive, but their absence pressed against her like a gentle, persistent ache. Yet as the days passed, new rhythms emerged. The local news piece about the release had gone national, and her inbox was flooded with requests. Journalists wanted interviews. University colleagues wanted to quote her research. And conservation groups reached out for advice. But what struck Evelyn most were the messages from ordinary people, letters and emails from children who had seen the video in their classrooms, from ranchers who had once seen Mustangs as pests, but now wondered if there might be another way, and from other scientists who felt renewed pride in their work. She agreed to a few interviews, her nerves raw each time a camera pointed her way or a reporter called. She talked not only about the technical details about wound care, herd behavior, and humane wildlife management, but about the fragile trust she had built with Willow and Sentinel. "What I learned," she said during a video call with a university wildlife management class, "is that trust doesn't happen in a vacuum. It grows when you show up every day, when you listen, when you risk being vulnerable." Her story struck a chord. Within a month, Evelyn was invited to speak at conferences and universities under the banner Trust Beyond Species. At first, she hesitated. She still felt the sting of her professional fall from Grace. The old scandal was never far from people's memories, nor her own. But as she listened to the questions from students, the curiosity from kids in small towns, the encouragement from teachers and fellow biologists, she found herself standing a little taller. She spoke about patience, about humility, and about her own journey from isolation and doubt to belonging and hope. One conference, hosted by the Nevada Department of Wildlife, became a turning point. Evelyn spoke to a room packed with rangers, scientists, ranchers, and activists. "There's a narrative that wild horses and humans must always be in conflict," she said, scanning the faces of skeptics and supporters alike. "But what if, just for a moment, we tried partnership instead of control? What if conservation could mean empathy as well as science?" The room was silent for a long moment before a ranger in the back raised her hand. "How do we start?" she asked. Evelyn smiled, with listening and with trust. Her approach sparked debate, but also action. The state began reviewing its Mustang management policies, convening new panels that included not just officials, but local residents and scientists with practical field experience. Evelyn was asked to contribute, and for the first time, her expertise was not questioned or overshadowed by old grudges. She mentored new graduate students, encouraging them to spend more time in the field, to observe quietly, to respect what they didn't understand. One of those students, a young woman named Maria, visited the ranch in late autumn. She shadowed Evelyn for a week, observing wild horses from a distance, learning to interpret subtle cues. On the last night, sitting under a sky so clear the Milky Way looked painted above them, Maria asked, "What's the hardest lesson you've learned out here?" Evelyn took her time before answering. That letting go isn't failure. That sometimes the best thing you can do for another living being is to trust that they'll find their own way. She paused, listening to the distant sound of hooves, the wind in the sage. And that healing takes more than medicine. It takes patience. It takes faith. Maria nodded, scribbling the words in her journal. As autumn deepened, Evelyn's ranch became a small but growing model for a new kind of research and outreach. Local school groups visited to learn about mustangs and the ecosystem. Evelyn led walks along the ridges, teaching children to read tracks in the dust, to notice the signs of coyote, rabbit, and wild horse. Sometimes, if they were quiet and lucky, the herd would appear. Sentinel at their head, Willow running free. The mustangs themselves became symbols. Photos of Sentinel and Willow were used in educational programs and documentaries, their story cited in articles about successful wildlife rehabilitation. National Park staff called Evelyn for advice, and she found herself consulting on similar rescues across the West. But the changes weren't just external. Evelyn's own sense of purpose and belonging grew stronger with each passing week. She forged closer friendships with her neighbors, started sharing more of her daily life on her field journal blog, and, for the first time in years, reconnected with her family back east. They had watched the news, seen the stories. Her father, never one for sentiment, left a single voicemail. "You did good, Ev. Proud of you." Sometimes, Evelyn would sit on her porch at sunset, coffee warming her hands, watching the Mustang herd on the horizon. She thought about the night Sentinel first came to her door, about the fear and hope that had carried her through. She knew she'd never fully belong to the world of the wild, but she no longer felt separate either. Evelyn had learned to be a bridge between science and empathy, between solitude and community, between the wildness in herself and the wildness in the world. The lessons of the past year ran deep, pain, humility, and resilience woven into every moment. She kept teaching, kept learning, kept believing that trust, between species and within herself, was the most powerful force of all. As winter crept in, the Mustangs grew thicker coats and moved to lower ground, always just in sight, never too far. Evelyn smiled each time she glimpsed Willow's pale mane flashing through the brush, Sentinel's bold stride leading the way. She knew that the story wasn't ending. It was only growing deeper, richer, and, like the Nevada sky, full of promise. Winter came quietly to the Nevada range, the world transformed by frost and early twilight. At Evelyn's ranch, the days grew short, the air sharp with the promise of snow. In the mornings, ice rimed the fence rails and coated the fields in silver. Most of the Mustang herd had drifted to lower ground, but Sentinel and Willow could still be glimpsed at sunrise, grazing near the edge of Evelyn's land, wild and watchful as ever. Inside the ranch house, warmth spilled from the wood stove, and the kitchen always smelled faintly of coffee and hay. But life was anything but isolated. Evelyn's story and that of Sentinel, Willow, and the herd had found a life of its own. What began as a crisis had grown into a movement. Schools sent requests for visits to the ranch, and almost every week, a van full of children would arrive, eyes wide, notebooks in hand, eager to learn about the land, the wild horses, and the quiet power of observation. Evelyn would walk them to the far paddock, her boots crunching in the frosted grass, explaining tracks in the mud, the chemistry of soil, the importance of patience. Sometimes, if they were lucky, Sentinel would emerge from the brush, Willow at his side, pausing for a long, silent moment before vanishing into the pale light. The ranch became a hub for researchers, students, and even skeptical ranchers from neighboring counties. Workshops filled the barn with laughter and debate. University biologists studied Evelyn's field notes, now published in respected journals, and learned to balance scientific rigor with humility. Wildlife officials brought new policy ideas to the table, drawing on Evelyn's experience to shift their approach, moving from control and capture to community education and gentle intervention. One brisk afternoon, a documentary film crew set up along the fence, their lenses trained on the distant herd. They interviewed Evelyn under the wide Nevada sky, asking her what she believed had made the difference. She considered her answer. It wasn't just skill or science, it was trust. Trust is a risk, but it's also a bridge, between people and animals, between old ways and new. Every time we choose empathy over judgment, we change what's possible. The film aired nationwide, sparking a new wave of public interest. Letters arrived from as far away as Maine and Alaska, teachers sharing drawings from their students, park rangers requesting advice, families thanking her for giving their children hope. Evelyn's story even reached policymakers in Carson City. The state recognized her ranch as a model for outreach and research, funding programs to bring more kids and young scientists to the range. Journalists returned, documenting the changes in Mustang management, fewer roundups, more monitoring, and an emphasis on working with, not against, the wild. In the spring, Evelyn was invited to speak at a conference in San Francisco. She stood before hundreds of conservationists, educators, and lawmakers, her nerves steadied by years of trial and quiet triumph. What I want to leave behind isn't just a new way of managing wild horses, she said, but a new way of seeing the world, one where humility, patience, and partnership matter as much as expertise, where everyone wild or human gets a chance at a second act. After the applause faded, a young biologist approached her. I used to think science meant keeping my distance, he admitted. But your story showed me that sometimes you have to step in. You have to care. Evelyn smiled, seeing herself in the earnest faces of the next generation. She encouraged him to come to the ranch that summer. The wild teaches best when we listen, she told him. You'll see. Back home, Evelyn maintained her daily rituals, recording data, mending fences, teaching, and walking the range. The Mustang herd visited often. Willow, fully healed, had grown into a striking mare, independent and swift. Sentinel remained the undisputed leader, his presence calming, his loyalty unbroken. Evelyn sometimes stood at the edge of her land in the twilight, looking out as the Mustangs grazed in the golden light. She felt, finally, that she belonged to the land, to her work, to the long, complicated conversation between wild and human. Neighbors who had once doubted her now brought their own children to meet her. The local school district invited her to help design new science programs. The little crayon drawings from Mrs. Herrera's class, now faded, still hung on her barn wall, a reminder that every story starts with a small act of courage. She remained humble about her place in all of it. I was just the bridge, she'd say. The wild did the rest. The real legacy, she realized, was in the changes rippling outward. Ranchers and rangers working together, students inspired to study ecology, lawmakers choosing collaboration over conflict, communities rallying to protect their open spaces. Late one evening, as spring returned, Evelyn stood on her porch, a mug of tea warming her hands. The sky blazed with stars. Out in the dark, she heard the unmistakable sound of hooves, steady, purposeful. Sentinel led the herd past her fence, Willow at his side, the younger colts and fillies trailing behind. For a long moment, Sentinel paused, head high, eyes shining. Evelyn met his gaze, her heart full of gratitude. In that moment, the boundaries between worlds, the wild and the human, the past and the future, blurred and faded. Evelyn understood, at last, that true progress wasn't about control or conquest. It was about respect, trust, and letting every living thing find its place. She smiled, knowing her greatest achievement wasn't a paper or a policy, but a legacy of empathion that would echo across the Nevada hills for generations. And when people asked what made the difference, she'd tell them, we chose trust over fear, partnership over control, empathy over judgment. That's how you build a bridge-owned step. One story, one wild heart at a time.